Reiner and Nick got into a, quote, very loud argument. His behavior at Conan's house alarmed the guests because it was so bizarre. One of the guests recalled Rob Reiner telling his son his behavior was inappropriate.
Conan O'Brien has always been the voice of calm in chaos, a late-night legend who mastered the art of staying lighthearted even when the world felt heavy.
It's a very sad story.
But behind his signature smirk, there's a story he rarely tells. It involves a night that still lingers in the minds of those who were there.
I got to know him. He was such a beautiful man.
A private holiday party. Familiar faces, an energy that shifted quietly, then never quite returned to normal.
I saw this thing, and I thought, well, surely you've seen this. That was a loss that clearly had a huge effect. The story, and it's absolutely unbelievable.
When Conan finally spoke about that night, what he shared wasn't a dramatic tale of scandal. It was something deeper, something more difficult to define.
Nick attended Conan O'Brien's Christmas party. He was wearing a hoodie. Reports are that he was acting weird, apparently accosting celebrities outside. Nick reportedly stormed off in a huff after a tiff with Bill Hader of SNL and Barry at Conan's Christmas party, and that Rob had been telling people, friends, that they were scared for Nick and scared for his mental state, that it was deteriorating.
What he witnessed, according to those close to him, unsettled him in a way that comedy could not cover. It wasn't about a single moment. It was about everything that didn't get said. The gathering was held at Conan's own home, one of those cozy Hollywood parties where the guest list reads like a call sheet for an awards show. Rob Reiner, the legendary director and longtime friend of Conan's, arrived with his adult son, Nick. At first, nothing seemed unusual. People mingled, music played softly, but as the evening wore on, something began to shift. Those nearby noticed Nick stepping outside more than once. Conversations seemed to pause when he walked by. It wasn't dramatic, but there was a strange kind of unease, a feeling that something wasn't sitting right beneath the surface. It was the kind of night where people remember glances more than words. Throughout the evening, the atmosphere remained oddly tight. Guests would later say there was no clear confrontation, nothing that screamed danger. But there were moments of tension, strange enough to be remembered later in detail.
Look at him with his head kind of shaved, and I don't know if that's what he looked like, but he looks like he's got a screw, or an evil screw. So he was 32 years old. He was at a holiday party hosted by Conan O'Brien.
Nick appeared distracted and emotionally distant, and his father seemed concerned. There was a brief disagreement, and while it didn't escalate into anything loud or physical, the energy in the room had clearly changed. One person mentioned feeling like something had already happened, even though nothing obvious had gone wrong. As the host, Conan tried to keep the evening on track. He made conversation, played peacekeeper, and did what he always does best, kept things moving. But internally, he seemed shaken. In private, long after the party, he would reflect on how quickly the tone of the room had changed. He didn't describe panic or fear, but he admitted that something about that night stayed with him. Not because of what anyone said, but because of what no one did. What happened after the party is now the subject of intense public scrutiny. But in that moment, there were only questions.
Conan O'Brien telling guests at the party who wanted to call 911 to not do so. Obviously, Conan O'Brien is not responsible for this man's behavior.
Conan had been in rooms with every kind of personality. He'd navigated awkward silences, difficult egos, and offbeat energy for decades. But this felt different. That quiet tension, the way everyone seemed to sense something but couldn't quite name it, became impossible to forget. And when Conan finally spoke about it, it wasn't to assign blame or tell a dramatic story. It was to express the weight of not knowing, the kind of weight that builds slowly, in hindsight, through a string of moments that seemed small until they didn't. That night, no one expected anything beyond casual holiday chatter, but what Conan witnessed has now become one of the most talked about moments in recent Hollywood memory. Not because of what happened, but because of what might have been missed. As the public started to learn more about what happened in the days after that quiet holiday party, a different kind of story began to take shape, one not captured in headlines, but whispered among insiders.
If they had called and Rob Reiner's son was placed on a psychiatric hold, Rob Reiner and his wife would probably still be alive today.
At the center of it all was Nick Reiner, a man with a recognizable last name and a personal history many in Hollywood were aware of, but few truly understood. For years, Nick had been open about his struggles. He had faced personal challenges from a young age, dealing with emotional pressure that was made more complex by the weight of family legacy. At one point, he even co-wrote a film with his father about his experience, a semi-autobiographical drama that critics called honest and raw. For a while, it seemed like things were getting better. But as people close to the family now admit, not everything had been resolved. There were signs of difficulty long before the night at Conan's house. In private conversations, friends had expressed concern about Nick's mental state. They described moments of withdrawal, unpredictable mood shifts, and increasing isolation. Some of these incidents happened in public, others behind the scenes. Still, they weren't explosive. They were subtle, easily brushed off. In an industry that thrives on appearances, these warning signs were treated more like uncomfortable side notes than emergencies.
Conan O'Brien stopped a friend from calling 911 during an explosive fight between Rob and Nick Reiner at the comedian's Christmas party just hours before the director's son allegedly took his parents alive.
The night of the party, those small concerns took on a much sharper edge. While Nick's behavior didn't break the flow of the evening entirely, it cast a strange tone across the room. He seemed disconnected, at times agitated. One guest recalled watching him pace near the edge of the backyard, almost like he didn't know whether he wanted to stay or go. People noticed, but no one quite knew what to say. That's often the problem in circles like this. Everyone senses something is wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. And when someone finally suggested calling for help, the idea didn't get far. It wasn't ignored, but it was held off. The general feeling was that things would calm down on their own. This wasn't about denial. It was about not wanting to escalate something that still felt vague. Conan, hosting in his own home, tried to de-escalate the tension without making a scene.
One source tells NBC News that Nick allegedly interrupted a discussion involving comedian Bill Hader. After Bill told him it was a private conversation, Nick reportedly stood still and stared before, quote, storming off. E! News has reached out to representatives for Bill Hader for comment. 32-year-old Nick was arrested the next day for suspicion of murder and is currently being held without bail.
According to people who spoke with him later, he genuinely believed that things were under control or at least manageable. He didn't shout, didn't panic. He simply kept the evening moving. But what stayed with him afterward was the uncertainty, the question of whether something should have been done differently, whether a line had been crossed that no one recognized until it was far behind them. As the days passed and the situation began to unfold more publicly, those small decisions, the ones made in the name of peace, privacy, or simply trying not to overreact, took on new weight. And for Conan, who had hosted countless events and been around all kinds of personalities, this moment felt different. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it left a mark, not just on him, but on everyone who was there. The feeling of something not being right didn't fade after the party ended. It stuck. In the weeks that followed, Conan O'Brien became noticeably more reserved. For a man who made a career out of delivering punchlines and keeping audiences at ease, his silence was impossible to miss.
Multiple attendees have reported seeing Rob, 78, and his wife, Michelle, 70, having a heated argument with the 32-year-old Nick at O'Brien's LA mansion on Saturday night. Nick is said to have been behaving erratically all evening, but one source familiar with the party has now told the Daily Mail that the spat grew so intense that at least one guest suggested calling the cops to intervene.
Close colleagues began to notice a change in his energy, subtle but undeniable. He continued working, filming, writing, doing everything expected of him, but something behind the eyes looked different. Those who knew him best say the night of that party hadn't just unsettled him in the moment, it had stayed with him, lingering like unfinished business. Not because of anything loud or obvious, but because of the quiet, tense spaces in between. Conan has never been the kind of person to air private emotions in public. His on-screen presence has always leaned toward control, structure, timing. But during a small, off-the-record conversation weeks after the party, he reportedly spoke about that evening for the first time in a way that was surprisingly raw. According to those present, he didn't offer a dramatic retelling. He didn't point fingers. What he shared was simple, a deep sense of discomfort that he couldn't quite explain. The way Nick Reiner had looked, the atmosphere that hovered just beneath the surface, the feeling that something was about to go wrong, even though nothing had yet.
Convicted, Reiner could face life in prison without the possibility of parole or even the death sentence.
Having the death penalty on the table is absolutely a bargaining chip. The prosecution is going to leverage that to try to get some sort of deal.
In a statement, the couple's two other children, Jake and Romy Reiner, said, "Word cannot even begin to describe the unimaginable pain we are experiencing. They weren't just our parents, they were our best friends."
It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was more like a heaviness, a recognition that he had been standing just a few feet away from something fragile, something that felt like it could fall apart at any second. And even though he didn't know exactly what was happening in that moment, he couldn't shake the idea that maybe, just maybe, he should have done something more. It's a feeling that doesn't come with blame or certainty, but with regret that grows in the quiet hours after the cameras turn off. He had hosted 1,000 parties before, met thousands of people, navigated awkward encounters more times than he could count. But this one felt different. This one didn't leave his mind. And here's where it gets even more complicated. In the days leading up to the incident, several people in Rob Reiner's circle had expressed concerns about Nick's behavior. Some described him as distant or distracted. Others recalled short conversations that felt unusually tense or unfinished, but none of it was enough on its own to raise alarms. And that's part of what makes this story so unsettling. There wasn't one clear warning sign, but a series of small, subtle signals that only made sense in hindsight. By the time people began to connect the dots, it was too late to act on them. What Conan reportedly struggled with most wasn't the moment itself, but the silence afterward. The realization that something important had gone unsaid. That one more question, one more check-in, might have changed the course of what came next. It's not a matter of blame or responsibility. It's about the fragile balance between privacy and protection, especially in a community that's trained to keep things looking polished at all times. The real story of that night isn't about chaos. It's about the moments that looked quiet but felt loud, the gestures that didn't seem significant until they echoed afterward. After the incident made its way into public awareness, the tone inside the entertainment industry shifted. Not in the loud, performative way you'd expect after a major Hollywood event, but in whispers, in glances exchanged on sound stages and studio hallways. There was no coordinated statement, no social media flood, just a spreading sense of discomfort. Something had happened, something serious, and everyone who had been anywhere near it was now reconsidering how they responded or didn't. At the center of it all, Conan O'Brien remained mostly silent, which in this context said more than any press release ever could. Those who were at that holiday gathering began revisiting every detail, not because they were looking for someone to blame, but because they were trying to understand how something so deeply unsettling could have unfolded right in front of them without setting off louder alarms. The truth is, in environments like that, surrounded by celebrities, comedians, producers, and media figures, people are conditioned to laugh off discomfort. An awkward exchange becomes a story for later. A weird moment becomes a quirky anecdote. But this wasn't quirky, it was tense. It was strange in a way that didn't fit the usual Hollywood script, and for some, it took seeing the headlines before they realized how serious that tension had really been. Inside those circles, Conan's decision to speak privately carried weight. He wasn't seeking sympathy. He wasn't trying to spin a narrative. Instead, what came across was reflection of how fragile moments can feel after they've passed, and how silence often holds more meaning than the noise people focus on. One detail that stuck with many was that several guests reportedly suggested calling emergency services during the party, and that the idea was discouraged in the moment. The reasoning, as it's been described by those close to the situation, wasn't neglect. It was hesitation, a desire not to escalate, to protect the space, the privacy, the people involved. But in the weeks that followed, that choice took on a heavier meaning. Hollywood thrives on carefully managed perception. Personal struggles are wrapped in branding. Family issues are filtered through PR teams. And most people in the business know how to keep things looking smooth, even when the truth is anything but. But this time, that illusion cracked. Behind the scenes, producers, writers, and executives started having different kinds of conversations, not just about the Reiner family or the events at the party, but about how quickly people dismiss concern as drama, how often they wait for something undeniable before stepping in, and how often, by then, it's already too late. The weight Conan reportedly carried wasn't about a single action or moment. It was about a pattern, a realization that even someone as experienced and grounded as him could feel something was wrong and still hesitate, not out of negligence, but out of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is what makes this story resonate so strongly behind the curtain. Because if Conan O'Brien, arguably one of the most emotionally intelligent voices in entertainment, could walk away from that night unsure of what just happened, then what hope do others have in spotting the signs before everything falls apart? As the conversation around that night slowly made its way through Hollywood's inner circles, the fallout wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, and deeply personal. In the months that followed, the Reiner family withdrew from public view, and the industry seemed to pause around the story, unsure how to handle something that didn't fit the usual narrative. There was no scandal to spin, no viral clip to reshare, just a tragic reality that reminded everyone how fragile people really are, no matter how powerful their names may be. And for Conan O'Brien, that fragility became the center of his reflection. Friends close to him began to notice a shift. He didn't change his work or stop performing, but the tone behind the scenes grew softer, more intentional. The man known for delivering laughs with perfect timing now spoke with more patience, more reflection. When asked, he never made the moment about himself. He never pointed to that night for sympathy or drama. But in conversations, especially with those who understood the weight of silence, he admitted something that stuck with people. He hadn't seen it clearly at the time. He just had a feeling, and that feeling never left him. The industry, always balancing between performance and real life, found itself forced to confront something uncomfortable. How many other moments had been missed? How many warning signs had been written off as personality quirks or bad days? And how many people had felt what Conan felt, unsure of what they were seeing, uncertain of whether to act, and haunted by the thought that maybe, just maybe, doing something small could have shifted everything? More importantly, this moment became a conversation about what emotional support really looks like in a space that often values image over truth. Late-night hosts, comedians, directors, and actors live in a world where being vulnerable is a risk, where showing concern can be seen as overstepping. But after this, that protective layer seemed thinner. Conan's quiet response, his private grappling with uncertainty, resonated with others in ways no tweet ever could. This wasn't about blame. It never was. It was about recognizing that even people surrounded by others can still feel deeply alone. That the signs aren't always dramatic, the warnings aren't always clear. Sometimes all there is to go on is a look, a tone, a hesitation. And when those moments pass, they don't disappear, they stay. For Conan, the memory of that night wasn't about what happened after. It was about what he saw in real time and didn't fully understand until it was too late. The entertainment world may eventually move on, but stories like this leave a mark. They linger in quiet moments backstage, in hallway conversations, in the long pauses between laughter. What Conan O'Brien witnessed that night wasn't a scandal, it was a shift. And while he may never talk about it publicly in full detail, the people who've heard him reflect know that it changed him, and that's something this industry doesn't forget easily.